Minister of National Security, the Honorable Dr. Horace Chang, the Commissioner of Police, Major General Anthony Anderson, the Chief of Defense Staff, Lieutenant General Rocky Meade, Senator Robert Morgan, the Parliamentary Secretary, and members of the media. Good morning. You may be seated. May I also welcome those joining us live on Love 101, IRI FM, Nationwide Radio, OPM TV, JI's website, and of course the Prime Minister's social media pages. We will start this morning with a presentation by Prime Minister, the Most Honourable Andrew Holness.
Good morning, everyone. That doesn't sound like you had breakfast. I don't understand OPM. We called you out this early and we didn't provide breakfast. We have to do better than that. Let's try it again. Good morning, everyone. After careful consideration and review of the current crime situation, His Excellency the Governor General has declared a state of public emergency for the Police Division of St. Andrews South. The Commissioner of Police will give the reasons, and the Chief of Defense Staff will give the boundaries and other specifics relating to the operations of the state of public emergency, so declared. I decided to advise the Governor General to make such a declaration on the recommendation of the Chief of Defense Staff and the Commissioner of Police. I wanted to today give the public a strategic understanding of the actions of the government as it relates to crime fighting and dealing with violence in the society. If we may have the slides. Well, I just said if we may have them. Oh, I see they've changed upon me now, so it's more modern. So then, if you would permit me, cameras, I may step away from the podium to be able to point out. Carry the mic when I'm doing that, sure. Government has, as its first responsibility, the preservation and protection of life. Government measures and indeed keeps track of deaths in the society, not just for the purposes of statistics, but it is important for governments to ensure that the average citizen feels safe and secure. Now, death is a part of life. We accept, we understand that. So people will die for health reasons, natural causes. But even then, the government still measures. So we are very concerned when we see many Jamaicans dying of non-communicable diseases, such as hypertension, diabetes, and other such diseases. And in fact, if deaths related to health reach a certain level, we sound an alarm. We call for emergency measures. Clearly, if they are communicable and they reach to the point where we consider it an epidemic, then we would immediately institute emergency measures. There would be no question. There would be no issues as to whether or not we should institute emergency measures to preserve life in those circumstances. However, there is another set of circumstances which precipitate death, and this is violence. We don't treat violence as a disease, and indeed, in our society, we have accepted, if not normalized, violence. We have calculated it into our normal social transactions. So it would appear that there is no sense of emergency when we lose lives as a result of violence. But let's dig deeper into violent death. We have killings in war or conflict. That is not the case in Jamaica. And then there are non-conflict deaths, and then there would be self-inflicting deaths, suicides. In non-conflict death, which would be where Jamaica is focused and concentrating its attention, would be what we describe as intentional homicide. In Jamaica, the term we use is murder. That is, someone intentionally, deliberately takes an action that deprives someone of their life. Then there would be killings in self-defense. Clearly that would not be intentional. Killings in legal interventions. That would be someone coming in conflict with the police, and there is a legal killing. And then there would be non-intentional homicides, an accident, for example. And then, that would be as a result of neglect or negligence. But let's look at intentional homicides, because that is really what is the epidemic in Jamaica. And there are three general areas of intentional homicides. You have homicides related to other criminal activities, and that would be, for example, gangs or economic crimes. And then you would have interpersonal intentional killings. We would call that in Jamaica domestic, intimate partner, family relations, domestic murders, violence that generates domestic murders. And then we have socio-political. In the decade of the 70s, that would have been a significant part of the category of loss of life. But today, the two main categories that affect Jamaicans would be murders related to other criminal activities, gangs, and that would be 70% of all murders on average today. But that figure, as I said, is average. For interpersonal or domestic or intimate partner violence, we would say about 30%. I am not here saying that there are no killings or murders or homicides related to socio-political issues. Sometimes at election times we may see such issues, but they would not be significant enough to register as a percentage. So we could, for now, not ignore, but in dealing with the issue, deal with the two main causes. As it relates to deaths as a result of criminal activity, gangs, there are three actors that we have to pay attention to. Dons, who lead gangs, and who use guns. That is the feature. Dons, gangs, and guns. We note, however, that this is not the case in all communities in Jamaica or all parishes in Jamaica. In some parishes, it is the reverse. The cause of death would be more interpersonal. So, for example, in some parishes like Portland or St. Mary, it would be far more the case that the cause of death, homicide, would be interpersonal, domestic. In St. Andrew South, however, the main cause of death is gang-related, and the commissioner will give you that statistic. It would be probably a little bit more than 70% of deaths is caused by gangs in St. Andrew South. Interestingly, in St. James, since the start of the tri-parish state of emergency, the commissioner reminded me there have been 17 murders in St. James, of which 8 have been related to domestic interpersonal. So you see, as measures become more effective at controlling dons, gangs, and guns, you will see the interpersonal domestic variable playing a greater role in determining the cause of the homicide. Having laid that fundamental point, which is just for a recap now to say that violence is at epidemic proportions in Jamaica. It ought to be treated in the same way as we would treat any other epidemic, which is to put in place special measures to arrest it. The main cause of violent death in Jamaica would be the category, or would be dons, gangs, and guns, or deaths related to criminal activities. I want you to pay close attention to this slide. This slide gives you the number of lives lost through violence, through homicides, intentionally, from 1960 to present. It's very important that we pay attention to this slide because it gives you the magnitude of the problem. In the decade 1960 to 69, 855 lives were lost due to violence. Or rather, homicide, to be specific. In the decade 1970 to 79, 2,686 homicides or murders. In the decade 1980 to 1989, 4,870 murders, homicides. In the decade 1990 to 1999, 7,621 homicides. And the decade 2000 to 2009, 13,418 murders, homicides were committed. Now, when you start to quote numbers in those regions, that would be almost the equivalent, or you start to be categorized as a country at war. Because that sounds like the death toll from a war. In the decade 2010 to 2018, not quite a decade, but in that period, we should see the outcome of that decade in another year or so. You would see that there is a decline, moving from 13,418 to 11,379. I want to make a few points here. Firstly, the exponential increase in homicides, murders, up to 2009, from 1960 to 2009, occurred in spite of government's intervention through various national security strategies. Some people will say in some periods, there were no particular kinds of well thought out intervention. Some people will say that certainly the periods 1970, 80 and onwards, there was a decline in the country's law enforcement capabilities. Some people will say that there was a disinvestment in the security apparatus. However, I'm not going to argue those points because I believe those points have been well established. But the point to note is that in spite of various administrations putting in place special squads, special task force, community policing, trying to rearrange the ranks of the force by improving training and leadership and management. Even with the Suppression of Crimes Act, the gun court, we have seen in that period, from 1960 to 2009, for each decade, murders moving from 855 in the decade of 1960 to 1969 to 13,418 in the decade 1990 to 1999. Or rather, sorry, from the decade 2000 to 2009. So in spite of those interventions, they have not been effective in bringing down the homicide rate. They have not been effective against violence in general, and it has definitely not been effective against violence that results in the loss of life. What has been effective? In the decade 2010 to 2018, where you would have seen now a decline to 11,379, almost 3,000, that would be it, almost 2,000 lives saved. We have had two interventions, two rounds of interventions, utilizing the tool of the state of public emergency. In 2010, we were literally forced into declaring a state of public emergency. And in 2018, we were deliberate and strategic in using that tool. And we now see the results. I want you to pay close attention to this slide. This is the actual murder rate, or rather the actual number of murders committed each year from 1962 to 2018. Now, anyone looking at this should be appalled, should be shocked. But this is the measure of the loss of life due to violence, intentional violence in our country. If this graph represented a disease, everyone would be saying emergency measures. If that were the graph showing hypertension, or heart disease, or cancer, everyone would call this a national emergency. But because we do not see violence, and especially violence that results in the loss of life, as a disease, because ultimately it is a social problem. And it is a disease. If it were a graph showing mental health issues, we would say this is an epidemic that has to be addressed. But there is something else that jumps out at you looking at this graph. You will see that it is a persistent increase. since 1962. But there have been periods when we have had spikes. There was a spike between 1979 and 1980. And we know that at that point in time, that was the bloodiest election. I think of it almost as an undeclared civil war. Then we would have had a spike between 1996 and 1997. And you can see the spikes going up to 1,674 murders, and that would be somewhere about 2005 or 6, 2005. And then in 2009, we went again to 1,673, that's correct. And then there was a decline in 2010 as a result of the intervention, and that decline continued to 2014. And then after 2014, we saw a rise once more. But aside from the spikes, we have also seen periods of decline. If you look at the graph, however, you will see that we have had a substantial decline in the period 1980 to 82. Then again, in the period 1997 to 1999. And then we would have had another decline in the period 2002 to 2004. We would have another sharp decline again in the period, that's 2005 to 2006. And then we've had another decline in the period 2009 to 2011. If you look at the periods of decline, you will notice that we have never had more than 2 years of decline in our murder statistics. We have never had more than 2 years of decline in our murder statistics. What does this say to the policymaker? It says that the government of whichever day has not been consistent in utilizing whichever measure it was that they put in place to fight crime. So consistency has always been an issue in crime fighting. So we'll get 2 years of decline, and then there's a spike. It says to us that we have never rallied around as a country a crime fighting strategy and have had the strength and conviction to stick with it. But it could also be that the crime fighting strategies that have been employed just did not work. It could also be that the crime fighting strategies were interrupted either by the political cycle, meaning elections would have come about, policies would have changed, or by administrative changes. Commissioners may have changed, they have taken different directions. And so it is clear from this graph that yes, Jamaica has an epidemic in violence that leads to murder, loss of life. The epidemic flares up on a routine basis, but it can be brought down by intervention. But the interventions have to be strategic and well planned and have to be at scale to the problem itself. And the interventions have to be long-lasting, they have to be consistent, and they have to have backing that carries it across either the political cycle or changes in the administrative cycle. That is what this graph tells you. So the lesson for this government is that, yes, we have to build consensus on the plan to reduce crime. Secondly, we have to put the resources behind the plan to reduce crime. And nobody can say that this government has not, and the Minister of National Security will outline to you the budgetary spend that this government has undertaken on crime fighting. I wanted to point out to you in more detail what has happened with murders in the last decade. So clearly, you can see in 2009, we benefited from the intervention in 2010. That intervention carried us to 2014, and then it spiked again in 2017, and then the interventions in 2018, which brought it down. We are now in 2019, and the government has intervened. Presently, where we are is the same place we were last year this time. Two things can happen. It is either the graph goes up or the graph goes down from here. It is my firm intention and commitment to carry that graph even further downwards, which is why we are employing a strategy that has been proven to work, and in the way in which we have refined it will work even better. There are other strategies being employed other than the declaration of states of public emergency. The Commissioner will outline many of those strategies. But you have to divide them into two categories. The first category are those that will immediately respond and suppress, and the second category are those that will prevent. The suppressive strategies are short-term, but the two work hand in hand. For the preventative strategies to work, which are more long-term, they take a longer time to come to fruition. The administration of crime, that is the police, the army, the Ministry of National Security, they need a breathing space. The truth is that the level of crime is over and above the present capacity of our law enforcement structures to respond in the normal, conventional, and traditional ways. So the government has to invest in building the capacity to address it. That takes time. Procurement alone for new cars will take a year. What happens during that period of time? Do we throw our hands up and allow people to die for the want of new vehicles whilst we are procuring them? It's just the reality of our public bureaucracy. We, of course, try to get it as quickly as possible, but it is the reality. So the two strategies, the short term and the long term, have to work together. But even outside of that, with the number of crimes committed, 10,000, 11,000 for this decade, we do not have 1,000 investigators. Well, you will give the number. How many investigators do we have? Just over 1,000 investigators. So there are resource constraints which will not change within a year or 2 years. You know, you don't just pick an investigator out of a hat. They have to be trained. They have to get experience. So the government is employing not just one strategy, but a suite of strategies that complement each other. I wanted to point out to you the murder rate, which is a slightly different measure of murders. This is the number of homicides or murders per 100,000 population. What does this mean? Why do we use this measure? It is trying to give a sense of the exposure of the population to the probability of loss of life. So, clearly, in 1962, Jamaica's murder rate per 100,000 was 3.9. That's a very small probability of you losing your life in Jamaica. So Jamaica could be considered a relatively or a very safe place. In the United States, at that same time, did I get it? I did it the wrong way. In the United States at that time, it was 3.9. In Jamaica, it was 4.6. But they were basically at the same place. They were relatively safe. And they tracked both countries, the United States and Jamaica, in terms of the murder rate per 100,000, tracked each other up until 1974, when there was a clear departure. Jamaica became a very unsafe place. Clearly, the United States, their murder rate rose, fell, but it did not in any way compare to Jamaica's murder rate. Today, the murder rate in the United States is somewhere in the region of about 4.5 per 100,000. The world average, global average, is around 6 per 100,000. The average for this region, that is the Caribbean and Latin American region, is 16 per 100,000. And Jamaica's murder rate, as at last year, is now 47.2 per 100,000. That is not safe. It's not safe compared to the United States. It's not safe compared to the world average. It's not safe compared to the regional average. This is an epidemic, and there is no one who can tell me that the country should be satisfied with this and not be prepared to take extraordinary measures to address this problem. My final slide is to give you a sense of what the region looks like. And you can see, if this pointer works, yeah, it's just slightly, you can probably see that's Jamaica. So Jamaica, as I said, is in the category with Honduras. Honduras's murder rate is 40. But look at the highest in the region. Venezuela, 81.4. El Salvador, 51. Then comes Jamaica. So we are the third highest in the region. But look at everybody else. You know, Mexico, where there's so much, 25.8. Trinidad and Tobago, 37.5. Belize, 35.9. Guatemala, 22.4. Colombia, 25. Puerto Rico, 20. Costa Rica, 11. Uruguay, 11. Dominican Republic, 10. Panama, 9. Peru, 7. Bolivia, 6. Ecuador, 5.7. Argentina, 5. Paraguay, 5. Chile, 2.7. And that is where we are. So I would today want to rubbish this argument that things are normal and that our Constitution contemplated this kind of murder rate. Every Jamaican should be appalled at this, not just scared for themselves as a citizen, but as a country that we are at this level. And every Jamaican should be prepared to do what they can in the fight against crime. And what is it that a citizen can do? The first thing is to tell us what you know. Cooperate with law enforcement and give information on the dons, the gangs, and the guns in your community. They are the ones who are primarily responsible for this in Jamaica. There are many other actors that have to be addressed. Politicians who have been complicit, policemen who have been complicit. But the citizens themselves who live in the communities must not be complicit, because it affects you. It affects you. So, this is the state, and that is why we have decided to employ these measures, along with others, to ensure that we can bring down the murder rate. I go back to one of the slides to make a final point. I have said that it is our intention to bring our murder rate down as a first target to what is within the region. So this line here at 16, the regional average. We should mobilize resources, organize strategies, and execute to get our murder rate down to that level. It is not impossible. So if you look at the falls that we have had in the murder rate, you would have seen that they are pretty significant. So if you look between 1997 and 1999, it's a fairly good drop. If we had persisted, we would have reached there long ago. If you look at the drop in 2010, if we had really persisted, if we had gone on with another state of emergency at that time, in St. Catherine as we had proposed, we would have uprooted one of the most dangerous gangs in this country, and we would have probably been all the way now down to, we would have uprooted not just one, you're right, two of the most dangerous gangs then. So it is our intention to persist, and we will bring our murder rate down to make Jamaicans feel as safe as everyone else in this region. We should not be an outlier in this regard. Jamaica has too much potential, and we cannot allow the criminals, the dons, the gangs who use guns to prevent us from achieving our destiny of being a prosperous nation. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. And members of the media, please rest assured we will be distributing electronically the slides that the Prime Minister spoke to. May we now invite the Commissioner of Police, Major General Anthony Anderson, for his presentation.
Prime Minister, Minister of National Security, Chief of Defense Staff, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. The high level of violent crime that we're experiencing in St. Andrew South Division, particularly the upswing in the past 2 months, is at a scale and of a nature such that it greatly endangers public safety. The division has historically been one of the most violent regions in the country, with over 25 gangs currently engaged in inter- and intra-gang conflicts currently. Already since the start of 2019, the division has recorded the highest number of murders, 94, and shootings, 98, among police divisions in Jamaica. This murder figure places St. Andrew South as 33% above the next highest police division, which is Clarendon at 72. Murders in this division have increased by 19%, while shooting incidents by 40% over 2018. The gang warfare has restricted the free movement of citizens and has caused the disruption of livelihoods in sections of the division. The fear that is associated with this level of violence has undermined the daily lives of these communities and the residents. As a consequence, and in consultation with the Chief of Defense Staff, we have requested that a state of public emergency be declared in the St. Andrew South Police Division. As has been demonstrated through previous and current states of emergency, this methodology has been very effective in reducing violent crime. A state of emergency allows us to utilize our resources in a more effective manner, and this is achieved while simultaneously reducing violent confrontations with the security forces. By way of update, we have seen reductions in murders in St. James, Westmoreland, and Hanover of 65%, 76%, and 56% respectively when compared with the 2 months prior to the declaration of the tri-parish states of emergency. Like St. James, St. Andrew South is identified as a division with a violent crime situation that calls for the implementation of a state of public emergency. As we continue to advance a strategy to reduce crime across all divisions, utilizing several policing tools, focusing on gangs, guns, and dons, and focusing also on some public order issues. It includes a heavy emphasis on investigations and the use of technology, as well as institutional capacity building activities. But we must save the lives of our citizens and reduce the trauma to entire families when one member of that family is a victim of violence. As the chief indicator of an act of violence being a preceding act of violence, we must break the cycle. We must stand between those who would do harm and those in danger. Our objectives of the state of emergency in St. Andrew South are therefore to establish and maintain a period of low violent crime in the volatile communities within that police division, and to normalize these communities and provide safety for the residents. To disrupt the free movement of criminal gangs and weapons and deny them the opportunity to commit violent crimes. And to provide the opportunity for greater investigative focus on perpetrators of violent crimes and their facilitators. During this state of emergency, our priorities and areas of focus will be intensifying anti-gang investigations, the occupation of critical spaces controlled by criminal gangs, prioritization of investigation around high-risk offenders, and the enforcement of public safety and public order matters. We seek the support and cooperation of the residents and persons doing business or transiting the St. Andrew South Division, and indeed all Jamaicans. There may be some traffic delays and inconvenience, but we ask for your patience and understanding as we work to achieve a sustained reduction of violent crime, a reduced existence of risk factors, that's the guns, gangs, and dons, and a sustained partnership between the security forces and the citizenry. The public can assist by contacting Crime Stop at 311, which is, as always, completely confidential, by complying with the security officers at checkpoints, by adhering to the curfew guidelines, by notifying the JCF of any breaches of professional conduct by our own members. The JCF remains committed to respect for all, the rule of law, and to being a force for good. Help us to keep you safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. And now we'll have the Chief of Defense Staff, Lieutenant General Rocky Mead, with his presentation.
Thank you very much. Honorable Prime Minister, Minister of National Security, Commissioner of Police, Solicitor General, citizens of Jamaica, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. As at dawn today, the Jamaica Defense Force and the Jamaica Constabulary Force deployed to the St. Andrew South Division in keeping with the declaration of state of emergency along the following boundaries. In the south, extending in a southwesterly direction from the intersection of Chisholm Avenue and Maxfield Avenue, along Maxfield Avenue onto East Avenue, to the coastline in the vicinity of Petrodram, and extending along the said coastline in the vicinity of the Kingston Container Terminal to the Portmore Causeway Bridge. In the west, continuing in a northwesterly direction from the Portmore Causeway Bridge along the Fresh River, the shared parish border of St. Andrew and St. Catherine, west of Riverton, and extending to the vicinity of the westernmost end of the Belvedere to Ferry Secondary Road. In the north, extending in an easterly direction along the Belvedere to Ferry Road to the foot of Red Hills at the intersection of Perkins Boulevard, Mullines Road, and Red Hills Road. And in the east, starting at the foot of Red Hills Road at that said intersection, extending in a southeasterly direction along Mullines Road, Seaward Drive, Mimosa Road, Aloe Avenue, Bay Farm Road, Newark Avenue, Elm Crescent, Keesing Avenue, Hagley Park Road, O'Mara Road, and Chisholm Avenue at the point of intersection with Maxfield Avenue. The state of emergency will give the security forces temporary additional powers of search, arrest, and detention. We believe that this is necessary in order to give the security forces the necessary space to carry out the operational tasks that will be required to help bring a sense of normalcy to the communities affected. While we acknowledge that persons may be concerned about the implications of the security operations as they go about their everyday lives, we want to assure citizens that both the JDF and JCF have been properly trained and oriented to give due regard to basic human rights and citizens' rights of all persons within the communities. Our record in other areas in which states of emergencies have been declared is testimony to our commitment to carrying out our duties in a lawful and respectful manner. We will continue this approach in St. Andrew South. We urge citizens to acquaint themselves with the regulations and requirements governing a state of emergency in order to easily and conveniently transit the area as they go about their lawful business. During this period of the state of emergency, citizens will encounter various operations such as highly visible vehicle checkpoints. The purpose of these checkpoints are not to unnecessarily inconvenience citizens, but rather to add a robust element of security for residents, as well as other citizens transiting the area. We ask persons, as they approach the checkpoints, to lower their windows and during dark periods turn on their roof lights. This will allow us to more efficiently process you through. We also implore citizens that as they comply with the guidelines to transit the area, they should not slow down beyond what is reasonable and requested, just to observe what is happening. This may cause unnecessary traffic buildup. As we pledge to carry out our operations with the professionalism and respect that we are known for, we are also seeking the cooperation and support of all Jamaicans by imploring you to use the available tip lines. The Commissioner already mentioned the 311, and also there's a JDF tip line of, could we change that? Could we change the slide to the tip line numbers, please? So the JDF number is 876-837-8888. This will allow us to have the information we need about the gangs, the dons, and the guns in order to make a difference. This community support is a key component of our efficiency and rests heavily on your input and involvement. We'll be doing our part by publishing bulletins on social media and other media mechanisms about illicit activities and wanted men. Please help us to identify these individuals by reporting them. We anticipate that the success of our tip line so far will continue. In closing, let me reaffirm that the Jamaica Defense Force and the Jamaica Constabulary Force have both the commitment and capability to achieve success here in St. Andrew South. similar to what we have achieved in other areas where states of emergency have been declared. We welcome the continued support that we have gotten from citizens and various other groups, including private sector, as we strive to bring a lasting peace to our communities. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant General Rocky Mead. And now, finally, we have the Minister of National Security, the Honorable Dr. Horace Chang.
Thank you. Honorable Prime Minister, our Chief of Police, Chief of Defense Force, and our Solicitor General. My job is really to reassure the public that the government's policy is committed to a long-term solution to the criminal activity in this country. As we enter this phase of another phase of a state of public emergency, again, we take this opportunity to reassure you our commitment to providing resources to our security forces. And I begin there because I think that's where the individuals say the rubber hits the tar. And when we look at analysis of expenditure in the security forces over the last 20 years, in fact, since independence, I note, and I'm sorry I'll be able to put a graph up there, but I have it here, that expenditure on security services, especially capital expenditure, has been lower than 0.5% on an ongoing basis until 2017, 2018, when we went to 0.65%, and in 2019, for the first time in the history since independence, we went to 1%, 2019, 2020. And this reflects a commitment, as I said, to ensure we can take our security forces to a level that they can deal with the criminal activity in this country. Besides that policy, of course, we have to provide the security forces with what we call an effective legal framework. And our legislative agenda is focused on ensuring we have a strong set of legislation to deal with corruption, the gangs, and their leadership, and the criminal enterprise associated with them. In the case of corruption, we, of course, will operationalize MOCA during the course of this year. The final piece of legislation, the Code of Conduct, should be in Parliament, I think, as early as Tuesday, and you'll have an effective organization dealing with corruption. In fact, without prolonging that, they currently have over 330 cases in court. In the anti-gang legislation, we'll have its final 2 or 3 final sittings to look at various amendments. Until we get to those sittings, in fact, we are bringing to the House amendments to the Intercept Act to provide the security forces with an effective means of using modern technology to gather evidence in dealing with the criminal enterprises, the gangs, their dons, and the bringing together of guns in the country. The other element of the Ministry of National Security, which is a holistic approach to the entire dismantling of our gangs, will, of course, involve acting as a conduit in a window for the source of services being initiated by this government into critical and targeted areas. Targeted operations is the base of our activity. We have to look in the communities that have the major challenges. We have to identify the gangs and their leadership, the dons, and we have to protect our borders and stop the flow of guns that come to this country and kill Jamaicans. Of course, the Commissioner has outlined the causes for this particular event and will at other times outline the overall operation to improve the quality of our police force. But I want to take this again opportunity to assure you the government is committed to long-term solutions that will dismantle the gangs, prevent recruitment into the gangs, provide opportunities for young people, and ensure we have a police force that is properly equipped to deal with the modern criminal enterprises that are associated with our gangs, dons, and guns. They are major business operations, they corrupt the society, they undermine our institutions, and this government is committed to ensuring the resources are there, the organizational, institutional change required will be put in place by the leadership of the security forces, and they have the full support of this government. I close on that note, and if you have any questions at the end, we're happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chang, the Chief of Defense Staff, Lieutenant General Rocky Mead, and of course, the Commissioner of Police, Major General Anthony Anderson, and the Prime Minister, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness. May we also thank the audience in Radio Land, Love 101, IRA FM, and Nationwide Radio that brought our press conference live. Ladies and gentlemen of the media, we invite you now to pose your questions. We'll take some questions this morning. I recognize Dashan, of course, from TVJ. Please, for everyone else, raise your hand. We'll acknowledge you, and of course, you ask your question. Dashan.
Good morning, Mr. Prime Minister, Commissioner, Chief of Defense Staff, and Minister. Mr. Prime Minister, you mentioned that if we're going to be able to cauterize this crime situation, go up to the gangs, the guns, and the dons, citizens must play a part, but you also said that politicians and police are also complicit. Who do the citizens report to if they can't go to the police if they are complicit in this?
It's a very, very good question. And we have, within the National Security Council, discussed this issue. There has to be a process, a mechanism, where everyone can feel confident in. The Commissioner did not point out in his presentation, but in other fora, he has mentioned that a part of the strategy of the police, and indeed it has been the strategy of the military, to provide channels of secure communications with the public. And I will invite Commissioner to speak of the initiative that you have in place.
Okay, I think in properly answering that question, though, that there may be police officers who are complicit, but that is not a reflection of the entire force in any way. A lot of the information we get is through police officers, but largely through police officers who are known to the person who's giving them the information. We use the other methods, as mentioned here, to get information, and we have an intelligence bureau that is constantly collecting. The majority of police officers who are arrested, the vast majority are arrested by their colleagues. They do not accept, and we do not accept, that we should have members in our midst who are complicit. And so the fact that those people may exist should not be taken as a reflection of a position of the organization. And so there are many channels, and as I say, there are people who are trusted, and we do get a lot of information in the force because there are not a lot of our citizens who trust police officers.
But just before you go on, I mean, the Commissioner's answer is on point, that we cannot cast a blanket of pall over our security forces. And that, especially within the last couple of years, we have seen significant internal operations to purge the force. But I wanted to... Right, I wanted you to point out, for example, the changes you're making to your IOC.
Right. Okay. Thank you again, Prime Minister. Okay, so since the beginning of this year, we have done some significant changes in our internal affairs component of the force. I've reassigned one of my lead persons in this area, or probably the lead person in this area, Mr. Deputy Commissioner Selvin Hay, to lead this. He's restructuring it. We have changed some of the personnel. We have included some additional structures, some which are to come, to make it easier for the public to give us information in this regard, whether it is complaints about things or just tips or even commendations. So we're making a much, and how we track these through to a proper conclusion. That is in process. We're rolling it out. It's being led, as I say, by somebody who is not only known locally but internationally for their work in anti-corruption activities, and also audits, accounts of how we take care of the things that are in our custody. So that there's been a big shift in that area. It is going forward going to be the place of choice in which to serve in the JCF. Thank you.
But I'm spending a little time on the point because it is such a sensitive issue in the minds of the public. When I made a statement addressing the police officers at their conference, it created quite a bit of public stir because of my focus. Obviously, I was speaking to the audience, and therefore I made that point. Aside from the internal changes in the police force, which will see to the improvement of the integrity of its internal oversight, of its internal affairs, to ensure that the force presents to the public a body in whom they can have trust, in which they can have trust. The government has also invested over the past 5 years in MOCA. And MOCA is now emerging. It has gotten its own legislation. I believe its regulations are about to be tabled, so they are now truly independent. And in the time that MOCA has existed, they are now the third arm of our law enforcement capacity. So you have the JDF, you have the JCF, and now you have MOCA as an independent arm. So the JCF is working assiduously to improve its internal affairs, to make sure that the public can have confidence in it, that information that is given is treated with sensitivity and protected and used. But you also have MOCA, which has developed an excellent track record. So there are existing now credible channels and avenues with which the public can cooperate with the police and get results and at the same time feel safe. And I want to assure the public that one of my greatest efforts is to ensure that they can trust the police. Now, I am not here telling you that it is all roses. I am well aware of the situation. The fact is, the truth is, that we do within the police force not just intelligence and investigations, but they are now required to do on an almost routine basis polygraphs. In fact, policemen coming in are required to do polygraphs. Officers in existence are randomly, routinely polygraphed. And so we do have a profile. We do have a profile of the level of corruption that exists. The next piece of the puzzle is to be able to act and act decisively, and therefore the legislative framework has to be in place. We already have legislation. Policemen are being investigated almost on a daily basis and brought before the courts and discharged from the force. So that process is going on. But we are now developing another piece of legislation, which when it is finished, it is likely to be called the Protection of the Integrity of the Forces Act, the Law Enforcement Act, which will see a more streamlined way of ensuring the integrity of police officers. So we are going to the greatest lengths to ensure that the force is a force that we can be proud of and we can share information with. Lastly on this topic, we have always partnered with Crime Stop, and Crime Stop has been a very useful avenue through which information is shared. We would want to put it in the public domain once more that we intend to offer meaningful rewards for information leading to the recovery of weapons, as we did in the first state of emergency declared in St. James, which yielded great results. And you will hear more about that new program later on in the week.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Ms. Tamara Hale from Scene TV and Sportsmax.
Yes, good morning all. I'm Tamara McHale from Scene Caribbean News. And my question is for you, Prime Minister Holness, as it pertains to the parish of Clarendon. I understand that there has been several calls, repeated calls for a state of emergency. We understand that a JDF soldier was killed last night. Persons on the ground have been calling for that state of emergency. I know you had spoken to the fact that there are resource constraints within the force, but at the same time, I wanted to find out are there any plans to consider that?
It's a legitimate question, but my answer can only be to you that we have not said that we are not going to Clarendon. So, you know, all areas that are gripped by crime are candidates for this measure. Of course, it takes time to plan it because it is a sustained effort. We have to make sure we have the resources in place, and you have to also pay attention to topography and the built environment and the physical layout, because all of those impact how you deploy. So clearly, the area of Clarendon is slightly different in its urban layout as relates to St. Andrew South, which makes for a different kind of configuration of intervention. But all parishes that have this challenge of crime that is over and above what would be considered normal would be candidates for a state of public emergency.
But
Thank you,
can
Mr.
you be
Prime
a bit
Minister.
more?
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, Naomi.
I'm so sorry, but Mr. Hendricks actually had a follow-up to that. Are you allowing tomorrow? Okay, sure.
Oh, I was just wondering if you could be just a bit more specific, because you said it's going to be a candidate. Do you have any timelines in mind? It's going to be this year.
So may as well I just tell the criminals when I'm coming.
Well, that is true.
All right.
Yes.
The question I was going to ask is the rationale for going after St. Andrew South, as she has pointed out, based on the crime statistics, it's the bloodiest police division. Clarendon the second, St. Catherine South the third, St. James the fourth. But St. James is still having an increase in crime despite a state of emergency. Going into, based on the last police statistics I saw, which I didn't see the one that came out yesterday, I saw the one last week, which I was looking at just now. Based on the state of emergency in St. James, how many gangs have the police and the JDF managed to dismantle? We're going after gangs in St. Andrew South, but in this area that we are now, how many gangs have we dismantled so far?
Okay, firstly, let's make it clear. The state of emergency reduces violence. It creates the conditions for the gang investigations. So apart from the local team there, we've sent down additional persons to take advantage of that space. So we have a number of ongoing investigations, gang investigations there. Also in Westmoreland. Now, St. Andrew South is obviously, as you said, the highest rate, and then obviously the police division with the most gangs in it, and certainly the most active gangs. And so that is why we have gone there. The crime in St. James since the state of emergency has reduced significantly, the violent crime, significantly. As I said, the 2 months since the state of emergency, if you go back 2 months from that point, because we're in it for just over 2 months, of 2 months and a couple of days, you'll see a 65% difference over that. It's significant, and that's the real value that you see playing out. In Westmoreland, it was 76% if you go forward since the state of emergency and go back those 2 months. It's a 76% drop. What we saw in St. James, when I was looking at the figures a couple of days ago, we had actually had 17 murders since at that point in St. James, of which 8 were those interpersonal ones. 6 of them were gang-related, and then there were some undetermined ones at the moment. Yes. Right. But before that, I'm saying that whatever that is a 65% decline of what was happening before for the similar period. Okay? All right.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Commissioner. Our final question goes to Mr. Carol Walker.
Good morning. This question is for you, Mr. Prime Minister. As a country, we have a history of being very cooperative with our neighbors to the north in helping them protect their borders and what goes into their country. We are now beset by an influx of guns and ammunition that we don't manufacture. Do you or would you think of any plan to, let me word it properly, seek the cooperation of our neighbors from the north to help us stem the flow of guns into our island from their country?
I'm going to answer you in general terms, and then the Commissioner and the Chief of Defense Staff, if they wish, may give specifics. The cooperation between the government of Jamaica and the government of the United States is a strong and ongoing cooperation in all areas as it relates to national security, border security, crime and violence. In terms of the interdiction of weapons and other illegal contraband coming into the country, there are protocols and programs established for cooperation. You would have seen in the media recently where that was explained. Can they be strengthened? Can there be new initiatives? Yes, and we're always contemplating those. But bear in mind, and Jamaica must come to the understanding that our national security is our business.
Thank you so much, Mr. Prime Minister. It's 5 minutes to 12 o'clock, everyone. The CDS will respond, and then we can wrap this up. Thank you.
Just to add some specifics to what the Prime Minister said, what we have done is we have invested significantly in our maritime and air resources to tackle that, in addition to assisting more directly with the border control. And what I can say quite definitively is that we have had significant collaboration with our partners in terms of making those resources effective. We have had joint operations. They have been very successful. So the trade that takes place largely is one of drugs being traded for guns. And we have disrupted several efforts to export drugs in the trade for guns this year. And that has been with the cooperation of our significant partners. So it has been very effective, and we're going to continue to invest in our sea and air resources and continue the collaboration with our partners.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant General Rocky Mead, and the Commissioner, Major General Anderson, will respond as well.
Okay, so as I said, this is an issue that we work on all the time. We have significant cooperation from the ATF in the United States and access to their e-trace database, which tells us where guns are coming from. We also have a number of transnational investigations going on at the moment around some of the shipments we've found in Jamaica, and we've managed to interrupt through cooperation with our partners some of the shipments before they even reach Jamaica. So there is work going on in that regard. There's always more to do that we can do to make this better, but we certainly have gotten quite a bit of cooperation in that regard. Thank you.
And so we thank Prime Minister, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, the Minister of National Security, Dr. Horace Chang, the Commissioner of Police, Major General Anthony Anderson, and the Chief of Defense Staff, Lieutenant General Rocky Mead. Thank you too to members of the audience listening live on Love 101, IRA FM, and Nationwide Radio.